Somewhere beneath Vatican City, in a drawer that has not been opened in decades, there is a letter from a judge who helped condemn Giordano Bruno to the flames in 1600. The letter survives. The church kept it, and in it, the judge writes something that should not exist, a confession that if they burn him, history will not forgive them. They burned him anyway, and then they filed the confession. That is not the behavior of an institution hiding its crimes. That is something far stranger. An institution that preserved its own moment of knowing better, sealed it, and said nothing for 400 years. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds 85 linear kilometers of shelving. It contains uncanonized saints, unsent papal letters, plague correspondence, and the private wartime journal of Pius XVI, in which he records the torment of his own silence during the deportations. None of it was destroyed. All of it was kept. The question is not what the church was hiding. The question is, why an institution this powerful would choose to remember everything it was too afraid to say. And while you were down there, I would love to know, was the church's silence a form of cowardice, or is there a kind of integrity in preserving even the truths you cannot yet speak? But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. The air down here does not move. That is the first thing. Every morning, before the building has been breathed into by another human presence, before the first archivist arrives with his coffee and his careful silence, before the day has been given its particular texture of footsteps and hushed consultation, I descend, and I notice it again. Not cold exactly, something more precise than cold. A stillness that has been engineered over centuries, the way a garden is engineered, with intention and patience and a willingness to let things wait that most living institutions have long since abandoned. The temperature here is held at 17 degrees Celsius, not for comfort, for preservation. The distinction matters to me after all these years. Comfort is a human consideration. Preservation is something older, something that does not require a human being at all, only the discipline to maintain the conditions in which fragile things can survive their own fragility. I carry a folder this morning. I carry it the way I carry everything here, with both hands, with attention, with a practiced neutrality that is not indifference, but something closer to what I imagine a surgeon feels when he lifts an instrument he has lifted 10,000 times before. The weight of it familiar, the purpose of it never quite routine. The folder is gray at the edges, darker at the center, where a century of handling has pressed the fibers closer together. It is tied with a ribbon that was once red and is now the color of old brick, the color of something that has forgotten what it was trying to announce. And at the center of the folder, securing it against a world that no longer exists, a wax seal, intact, bearing the impression of a thumb. I do not open it immediately. This is not ceremony. It is not ritual in any formal sense. It is simply what I have learned in the years I have spent in these vaulted rooms beneath Vatican City about the relationship between a document and the moment of its opening. Some things require preparation, not because they are dangerous. I have handled dangerous documents, and danger has its own particular weight, something tighter, something that presses against the sternum. This is different. This requires preparation because it is true. Because what is inside has been waiting for 40 years in this drawer. And before that, it was waiting in another drawer. And before that, it was waiting in the hands of a man who did not know what to do with it, who knew only that it must be kept, that it must not be lost, that the institution to he had given his life, was not yet ready to say what this document contained, but was not, even so, willing to pretend it did not exist. The wax seal is the color of dried blood. I hold it up to the light. The particular quality of light down here, which comes from fixtures installed in 1962 and has never quite convinced me it belongs. And I can see the ridges of the impression, the slight irregularity on the left side where the thumb pressed harder or pressed at an angle, or where the wax had already begun to cool before the gesture was complete. A thumb pressed this. That person is dust. The impression remains. This is what the archive does. In the end, when all the scholarship and the cataloging and the careful temperature maintenance has been accounted for, it preserves the gesture after the body is gone. It keeps the shape of a human act long after the human has been returned to whatever preceded them. I set the folder on the reading table. I sit down. I allow myself a moment that is not quite thought and not quite feeling, but something that exists between the two, the way the archive itself exists between the past and the present, neither fully one nor fully the other. I have worked here long enough to know that I am not a scholar. I carry no particular authority. I have no doctorate, no published work, no theory about what this institution means, or what it should have done, or what it might yet become. What I have is proximity. What I have is the accumulated knowledge of a man who has spent decades in the same rooms as these documents, breathing the same carefully regulated air, carrying them with both hands, setting them down with attention, and listening. Not to what they say exactly, but to what they cost. I break the seal. The sound it makes is almost nothing. A small, dry surrender. A release so quiet it barely registers against the silence, which is itself so complete that I can hear the faint electrical hum of the climate control system in the ceiling, the distant sound of my own breathing. That is all. 3 centuries of intention, 3 centuries of a closed drawer and an intact seal, and a document held in suspension between the moment it was written and the moment it would be read. And the sound of its ending is almost nothing. I have learned over the years to take this seriously. The most important things in this archive make very little noise. Inside the folder is a single page. The handwriting is precise. That is the first thing I notice. Not the language, not the date, not the name signed at the bottom, but the quality of the script itself, which is the handwriting of a man who has been trained to think carefully and who thinks the same way he writes, with attention to each word, with a sense that language is an instrument that rewards precision and punishes carelessness. It is Latin, which I read slowly, the way I do everything here, without hurry. The letter is addressed to Rome. It comes from a Jesuit, somewhere in the 16th century, writing from a position of genuine faith and genuine intellectual difficulty. And what it asks is this: whether the days of creation, as described in Genesis, might be understood as metaphor rather than measure. He is not a rebel. I want to be clear about this because it matters enormously, because the temptation, looking back, looking down at this page from the distance of centuries, is to see him as a man ahead of his time, a proto-modernist, a visionary straining against the bars of orthodoxy. He is none of these things. He is a priest who loves the church and loves the truth, and has found, in his careful reading, a tension between them that he cannot resolve alone. He uses the church's own language. He draws on Augustine, on Origen, on the tradition of allegorical interpretation that the church itself has sanctioned and sometimes celebrated. He arrives by the church's own logic somewhere the church is not yet ready to stand, and he asks, with genuine humility, whether he is permitted to stand there or whether he must come back. In the margin, in a different hand, darker ink, a different nib, written perhaps weeks later, perhaps months, by someone who has read the letter carefully and sat with it and arrived at a conclusion. One word: untimely. I sit with this for a long time, not wrong, not heretical, not dangerous, not the language of condemnation, not the language of the Inquisition, not the language of an institution protecting itself from a threat. Untimely, which means we know what you mean, which means we have read this and we have understood it and we are not ready to say so, which means the truth has arrived before the institution has arranged itself to receive it, And the institution's response is not to deny the truth, but to defer it, to hold it in suspension, to file it in a drawer at 17 degrees Celsius and wait for a moment that may or may not come. I understand, sitting here, what kind of institution does this? What kind of institution receives a careful, reverent question and writes in the margin, not wrong, but untimely? It is an institution that knows the difference. It is an institution that has, somewhere in its long and complicated nature, a commitment to honesty that it cannot always act on, but cannot bring itself to abandon. It keeps the letter. It preserves the question. It does not pretend the question was never asked. It simply files it, carefully, with both hands, in a drawer that will not be opened for 40 years, or 100, or 3 centuries, because the drawer is not a grave. It is a waiting room. The Jesuit who wrote this letter is dust. The man who wrote untimely in the margin is dust. The Rome they both addressed and inhabited and served is gone in every way that matters except this one. It kept the record. It held the question. It pressed a thumb into wax and tied a ribbon and placed this single page in a folder and said, in the only language available to an institution that cannot yet speak, we know. We are not ready, but we will not forget. I think about what it costs to do this, not the physical cost, the temperature maintenance, the acid-free paper, the careful cataloging, but the other cost, the cost of holding a truth you cannot yet speak, the cost of knowing that the question is good, that the man who asked it was faithful and precise, and using your own logic, and still being unable to answer him, unable to ratify him, unable to say yes, stand there. That is a place where a person of faith may stand. The cost of writing untimely instead of the answer, and knowing that untimely is not enough, and keeping it anyway because it is the most honest thing available. I read the letter again, slowly. The handwriting does not change. The question does not resolve. The margin holds its single word like a stone holds heat, long after the sun has moved on. There is grief in this room. I want to say that plainly. Not the dramatic grief of scandal or betrayal. Not the sharp grief of a thing destroyed, but the slow grief of a thing held too long in suspension. A question that deserved an answer and received instead a careful silence and a closed drawer. The Jesuit deserved an answer. He asked in good faith. He used the church's own language and arrived at a place the church could not yet follow. And the church said, not yet, and meant it, and kept the evidence of its own, not yet, with a fidelity that is almost, if you sit with it long enough, a form of love. I return the page to its folder. I do not reseal it. The seal is broken now, and what is broken cannot be made whole again, only acknowledged. I tie the ribbon, which is the color of old brick, the color of something that has forgotten what it was trying to announce. I stand. I carry the folder with both hands to the drawer, which slides open on its runners with the smooth resistance of a well-maintained mechanism, and I set the folder inside, and I push the drawer closed, slowly, with both hands. The sound it makes is not a lock turning. It is not a secret secured. It is something more like a held breath, an institution pausing at the edge of what it knows, not yet ready to speak, not yet willing to forget, holding both in the same careful silence at 17 degrees Celsius in a stillness that has been cultivated over centuries, in a room where the air es not move. That sound is what I have come here to understand. I am not sure after all these years that understanding is possible, but I am here, and the drawer is closed, and the word in the margin is still untimely, and it has been untimely for 300 years. And somewhere in that long patience is a truth about this institution that I am not yet ready to name, only to carry with both hands with attention the way I carry everything here. The word stays with me as I climb back into the light. Untimely. It follows me up the stone stairs, through the corridor where the air begins to move again, out into the morning where the city is already loud with itself, already forgetting that beneath its feet there is a room that does not forget anything. I carry the word home. I carry it through dinner and into sleep. And in the morning, when I descend again, it is still there, waiting in the dark the way words do when they have found the right mind to haunt. But this morning, I did not go directly to the drawer. This morning, I stop, as I sometimes do, at the far end of the eastern corridor, where the oldest sections are kept, where the shelves are not metal but wood, and the wood has absorbed so many centuries of intention that it has become something other than furniture. It has become structure, weight-bearing. And I stand here in the oldest part of this place, and I try to remember what it felt like to build it. Not the physical labor of it, the stone, the mortar, the vaulted ceiling that someone calculated to last, but the interior labor, the certainty it required, the particular kind of faith that does not doubt itself because it cannot afford to, because doubt at that scale would not be a personal crisis. It would be a civilizational one. To understand what this archive is keeping, you must first understand what it was built to protect. And that means going back, not through dates. Dates are scaffolding, useful but cold, but through atmosphere, through the particular quality of air in a world where the church is not merely powerful, but is power itself. The organizing principle of an entire civilization's understanding of time, truth, and the nature of the real. Imagine a bell. Not a bell you hear as decoration or as punctuation, but a bell that tells you when you are. It rings at dawn and your body knows. This is when God intends you to wake. It rings at midday and the city pauses, not because someone has ordered it to pause, but because the pause is built into the structure of the day, the way breathing is built into the structure of a body. It rings at dusk and the light changes not only outside, but inside, in the chest, where something settles that had been held in motion since morning. This is not metaphor. This is the medieval city as it actually exists, organized from the inside out by an institution so total in its authority that to step outside, it would not feel like freedom. It would feel like stepping off the edge of a map into the blank space where the cartographers have written only, "Here there be nothing." The cathedral is built to make you feel small, not cruelly small, not diminished, but small the way a child is small in the arms of something that loves it. The nave is longer than any secular building you will ever enter. The ceiling is higher than any natural shelter you have ever stood beneath. The light comes through glass that has been designed to arrive at angles that seem less like optics and more like intention, as though the light itself has been instructed, as though even the sun is participating in the argument that this place is making about the nature of the real. The argument is not subtle. The argument is architectural. It says, you are small, and the thing you are inside of is large, and the largeness is not an accident. Into this world, in the early years of the 17th century, comes a boy named Mateo. He is perhaps 14 years old. He is a page in the Apostolic Palace, brought from a small town whose name I have read, but whose location I cannot quite fix on any modern map. Somewhere in the south, somewhere where the hills are dry and the summers are long, and the church is the largest building within a day's walk in any direct. Ion. He has never been to Rome. He has never been anywhere that Rome would recognize as anywhere. And now he is here, inside the center of the world, carrying documents from one corridor to another, sleeping in a room smaller than the closets that adjoin it, eating with the other pages in a refectory, that is, even by the standards of the palace's lesser spaces, more beautiful than anything he has seen before in his life. His letters home to his mother survive, 6 of them, written across a period of approximately 3 years, in a hand that starts uncertain and grows, with each letter more assured. Not more sophisticated exactly, but more practiced, as though the act of writing is teaching him something about the act of seeing. The first letter is almost entirely wonder. He writes about gold. He writes about it the way a person writes about water when they have been thirsty for a long time, not cataloging it, not assessing it, but simply registering its existence with a kind of stunned gratitude. The gold on the ceiling. The gold on the frames of the paintings. The gold in the light itself, which in Rome in certain seasons seems to arrive already gilded, already consecrated, as though the city has been arranged to receive it. He writes, "I did not know there was this much gold in the world. I did not know the world was this large. I am not afraid. I am amazed." I hold this letter with both hands when I read it, because it is the most direct evidence I have of what it felt like to be inside this institution at its height. Not from the inside of power, not from the perspective of a cardinal or a theologian or a pope, but from the perspective of a boy carry-eye. Eng folders through corridors, moving through the edges of authority, without yet understanding what authority is or what it costs. Mateo does not know, in this first letter, that what surrounds him is fragile. He does not know that the gold on the ceiling is, in some sense, a wager. He knows only that it exists, and that its existence seems to him like proof of something he cannot name, but does not need to name, because the cathedral has already named it, and the bell has already named it, and the silence between the bell and the next bell has named it too. Pope Gregory IV moves through this world like a man who has never been asked to doubt it. He is not a tyrant. He is not even, particularly, a politician in the cynical sense. He is something more purely institutional, a man so thoroughly formed by the structure that he and the structure have become difficult to distinguish from each other. When he files a document, he files it with the confidence of a man who believes it will never need to be reopened. Not because he is incurious, but because the world he inhabits does not produce the kind of questions that require reopening. The questions it produces are the questions the institution has already answered, has been answering for centuries, and the answers are not provisional. They are load-bearing. They hold up the ceiling. The archive, in this early period, is not a place of secrets. I want to be precise about this because it matters. It is a place of certainties, a memory palace for a truth that does not require revision. When I walk through the oldest sections, I can feel this. Not metaphorically, but almost physically. The way you can feel the difference between a room that has been lived in and a room that is being preserved. These early shelves are not holding doubt. They are holding confirmation. Document after document that says, in various languages and various registers of formality, this is what we know, this is who said it, this is when, this is why it will always be true. The archive is not a library. A library entertains the possibility of contradiction. The archive, in its earliest form, is a monument. A monument does not entertain anything, it simply stands. And yet, even here, in the oldest wood, in the most certain of the certain rooms, there is something I notice when I look carefully enough. The documents are not only confirmations. There are questions here too, filed alongside their answers in a way that seems, at first, merely procedural. The question preserved as context for the answer, the way you keep an envelope alongside a letter. But sometimes the answer is shorter than the question. Sometimes the answer does not quite touch the question at all. Sometimes the question is longer, more restless, more alive than the official response that was filed beside it, and you can feel, in the gap between them, the first faint pressure of something the institution has not yet learned to name. Mateo's second letter is still full of wonder, but there is something else in it now, something quieter, sitting beneath the wonder, the way a stone sits beneath water. He writes about silence. Not the silence of the bell between its rings, which is a structured silence, an expected silence, but a different silence. The silence of the long corridors at night, when the pages are supposed to be asleep and he is not sleeping, and he walks from his small room to the window that looks out over the courtyard, and the city beyond the courtyard is also mostly silent, and the silence of the city and the silence of the palace seem to him, in this moment, to be the same silence, and he does not know whether that is comforting or whether it is the beginning of something he cannot yet identify. He writes, "I am not afraid, but I am very far from home." I read this sentence and I set the letter down. I do not set it down because I am unmoved. I set it down because I need both hands free for a moment, because what Mateo is describing, without knowing that he is describing it, without any intention of describing it, is the first intimation of what the archive will become. He is describing the sensation of standing inside something vast and certain and beautiful, and feeling, for the first time, the particular loneliness of that vastness. The institution does not feel his loneliness. The institution is not built to feel loneliness. It is built to answer it, to absorb it, to transform it through ritual and structure and the organized beauty of the bell into something that resembles peace. But the loneliness is there. Even in the first century of this archive, even in the most certain of the certain rooms, the loneliness is there, filed perhaps under some other name, or not filed at all, simply present in the gap between the question and the answer, in the space where the document does not quite reach what it was trying to say. The secrets come later. They accumulate slowly, the way water accumulates behind a dam, not through any single act of deception, not through malice or conspiracy, but through the slow, steady pressure of a world that keeps growing, keeps asking, keeps producing questions the institution has not yet arranged itself to answer. The world before the crack is not a world without doubt. It is a world that has not yet learned to file its doubt, to preserve it, to hold it with both hands in the dark and wait. It is a world of gold ceilings and structured silence, and a boy far from home who is not afraid, or so he says, and who carries the first faint weight of something he will not name for years, if he names it at all. Certainties, I have learned, are the most fragile things in the world. Not because they are wrong, often they are not wrong, but because the world keeps growing around them, and growth has no interest in remaining still, and the ceiling that was built to make you feel small in the presence of something vast is also, by its nature, a ceiling. And ceilings, however beautiful, however gold, however carefully engineered to ever carefully engineered to car, are also, in the end, a limit. And the world, as it turns out, is under no obligation to stay within limits. The world keeps going. The world keeps asking. And the archive, slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins to change its nature, from monument to memory, from certainty to custody, from a place that holds what is known to a place that holds, with equal care and equal silence, everything that is not yet ready to be said. There is a morning, unremarkable in every visible way, when I descend the stone stairs and find a folder on the sorting table that was not there the evening before. Someone has pulled it from a deeper shelf, one of the older sections where the organization follows a logic that predates our current system by 4 centuries, and left it in the light as though it needed air. I do not know who left it. I do not ask. In this place, documents surface according to their own necessity, and the work of the custodian is not to question the timing, but to receive whatever arrives. The folder contains a single letter, not a copy. The original, in Latin, in a hand so deliberate it slows my own breathing to look at it. The ink has browned to the color of old honey. The paper has the texture of something that has been held many times, though gently, and the margins carry no annotation except one, written in a different hand, smaller and more official, the hand of someone accustomed to rendering judgment in very few words. I set the folder flat on the table and I read. The letter comes from a Jesuit writing in the middle of the 16th century, from somewhere in the north of Italy, though the precise location is not given. He does not announce himself with credentials. He begins instead with gratitude. Gratitude for the tradition that formed him, for the order that gave his thinking its architecture, for the scripture he has carried so long it has become a kind of interior climate. The gratitude is not ceremonial. It is the gratitude of a man who means it, who has lived inside an institution the way one lives inside a language, and who cannot conceive of thought that does not begin there. He is not preparing to leave. He is not circling toward defiance. He is, as far as I can tell from the texture of the prose, doing the most faithful thing he knows how to do, bringing his hardest question home. The question itself takes him several paragraphs to arrive at. He has been reading, he writes, in the natural philosophy of his age, the new astronomy, the emerging mathematics of celestial motion, the careful observations of men who have spent decades watching the sky and recording what they see. He does not name them. He does not need to. The Church knows which names he means, and he has found, in the convergence of this new knowledge and his own long study of Genesis, a possibility he cannot dismiss and cannot resolve alone. He asks whether the days of creation might be understood not as literal measures of time, but as something more like categories of divine intention. Not 6 days in the sense of 6 rotations of the earth, but 6 movements in the mind of God, each one complete in itself, each one containing a depth that no single reading can exhaust. He is not saying the scripture is wrong. He is saying it may be larger than it appears. He is asking the church to look again at something it has already decided, not to overturn the decision, but to consider whether the decision was made with all the available light. He closes with a sentence that I have read perhaps 100 times since finding this folder, and that does not yield its full weight no matter how many times I return to it. He writes, "I offer this not as a correction, but as a continuation, in the faith that the truth we have always sought is the same truth that the new learning seeks, and that there is room enough in God for both. There is room enough in God for both." I sit with that for a long time. The marginal annotation is a single word, written, as I say, in a different hand, smaller, more official, positioned in the upper right corner of the final page, as though the reader wanted it visible but not central. The word is untimely, not wrong, not dangerous, not contrary to Scripture, not contrary to faith, not contrary to the tradition the Jesuit has so carefully honored. Untimely. The word is a form of acknowledgement that is also a form of suspension. It says, "We have read you, we have understood you, we are not ready." And the terrible precision of it is that it contains no cruelty. It is not a dismissal. It is something more complicated. An institution telling one of its most careful thinkers that his thinking has arrived in the wrong season, that the calendar of the church does not yet have room for what he has found, that he must wait, without any promise of when the waiting will end. I turn the word over in my mind the way I turn documents in my hands, looking at it from every angle, trying to find in it what I need to find. Is it mercy? In some sense, yes. The Jesuit is not summoned, not examined, not burned. His letter is received and read and kept, and that is more than many received. Is it evasion? Also yes, in the way that all delay is a form of evasion, even when the delay is chosen out of genuine uncertainty rather than bad faith. Is it honesty? This is the angle I keep returning to. Because untimely, unlike wrong or heretical or dangerous, does not pretend. It does not construct a counter-argument. It doesn't believe. It does not dress institutional hesitation in theological language. It says plainly that the problem is not with the question, but with the moment, and that the moment is not chosen by the questioner, but by the institution, and that the institution is not ready. That is a kind of honesty. It falls just short of courage, but it does not lie. The Jesuit, as far as I can tell from the archive, never received a reply. His file ends with the letter and the annotation. What he made of the silence, whether he understood it as the specific silence of Untimely or the general silence of a Rome that received 10,000 letters a year and answered fewer, I cannot know. The archive preserves the document. It does not preserve his face when the reply did not come. I replace the folder carefully and move to the section that has been on my mind since I found the Jesuit's letter, because the Jesuit is not alone. He is the first instance of a pattern, and the pattern, once you see it, does not let you unsee it. There is a Benedictine abbot, writing perhaps 40 years later, whose file carries the same word in the same official hand, applied now to a man rather than an idea. The abbot has been corresponding with Protestant scholars in the north, not to debate, not to convert or be converted, but to read together, to find in shared scripture the shared light that the Reformation has made so difficult to name. He has found genuine holiness in these men. He says so plainly. He writes that their piety is real, their devotion unmistakable, their love of God legible in their faces and their letters, and the quality of their attention when they pray. He is not advocating reunion. He is not minimizing the rupture. He is simply reporting what he has seen and asking whether the Church might find a way to acknowledge that holiness does not observe the same borders as jurisdiction. His file is thicker than the Jesuits. There are multiple letters, a summary of testimony from a visitation, a note from his bishop that is warm and careful and clearly written by someone who admires the abbot enormously and cannot help him. The bishop writes, "He is brilliant, and what he sees is probably true, but the moment is not right." The annotation on the final document, in that same official hand, reads, "Brilliant, but untimely." I hold the abbot's file and feel something I have learned to recognize in myself, working in this place, as the specific grief of the archive. It is not the grief of tragedy, not the sudden violence of a life cut short or a truth destroyed. It is slower than that, and in some ways harder to bear. The grief of suspension, of a life held in a folder, of a mind that saw something real and was told to wait, and waited. And the waiting became permanent, and the folder closed, and the century closed over it. And here I am, holding it in the particular stillness of this room, and the abbot has been waiting for 400 years. What troubles me most is not that the Church said no. It is that the Church said not yet, and not yet is a promise, and promises require a someday, and someday is a very long time to hold a man in suspension. The archive is full of not yets. They accumulate across the shelves like sediment, layer on layer, each one representing a mind that the institution admired enough to preserve and feared enough to delay. The Jesuit with his metaphorical days of creation, the abbot with his ecumenical holiness, the Polish hermit who saw the collapse coming from within, filed as too vague, not pursued, the cloistered nun whose prophecy sits beside the formal record of her dismissal, as though the archive could not bear to separate the vision from the verdict, each of them untimely, each of them kept. And here is the thing I return to every morning when I descend into this stillness. The Church did not destroy these documents. It could have. It has, at various moments in its history, been capable of destruction. The burning of books, the erasure of names, the careful revision of the record. But these it kept. These careful, reverent, untimely letters from men and women who loved the institution enough to bring it their hardest thinking. These it filed and sealed and stored in conditions designed to make them last. There is something in that I cannot fully name. It is not courage exactly, because courage would have been to answer them. It is not cowardice, because cowardice would have been to burn them. It is something in between, something the archive itself seems to embody, a willingness to hold what cannot yet be said, to carry the weight of the untimely without pretending the weight is not there. I think about the Jesuit sometimes, composing his letter in the north of Italy, choosing each word as though words were a form of prayer, believing that the institution he loved was equipped to receive what he had found. He is not wrong to believe that. The institution does receive it. It receives it and keeps it and will not release it. And the keeping is its own kind of answer, though not the answer he needed and not the answer he deserved. The crack that opens in this century is almost invisible from the outside. From inside this archive, holding these documents in both hands, it is unmistakable. Not a fracture in the faith, but a fracture in the institution's ability to keep pace with its own deepest thinkers. A gap opens between what the Church knows and what the Church can say, between the truth it has received and the moment it judges ready to receive it. The gap is not dishonesty. The gap is something more human than that, and therefore more difficult to judge. It is the gap of an institution that has organized itself around certainty and finds, in the questions of its most faithful minds, a certainty it cannot yet afford to speak aloud. And so it files, and so it waits. And so the drawer closes, quietly, on one century and then another, and the word untimely sits in the margin of a letter written by a man who had room enough in God for everything, and was told, gently, without cruelty, without explanation, to wait. I close the abbot's folder. I return it to its shelf. The air in this room does not move. It has not moved in centuries, and the stillness is not emptiness. It is accumulation, the weight of every untimely truth this place has ever received and kept and could not yet say. I carry that weight back up the stairs with me every morning into the light, and the light does not know what to do with it either. The next morning is a Tuesday in November. I know this not because I have checked a calendar, but because the light through the one small window at the top of the stairs has that particular quality November brings. Thin, patient, the color of old paper. I descend. The air closes around me the way it always does, not as a threat, but as a kind of recognition, the archive acknowledging that I have returned, that I am still here, that the work continues. I carry with me the residue of yesterday, which is what this place does to you. It does not let you leave clean. The abbot's word follows me down, untimely. I have been turning it in my mind since I set down his folder, the way you turn a stone you have found on a path, not because you intend to keep it, but because the weight of it is interesting, because the weight tells you something about the ground it came from. I am not looking for anything specific when I reach the section I think of privately as the neighborhood of the dismissed. This is not an official designation. The archive has its own language of organization, its own logic of proximity, and that logic is not always the one I would have chosen. But I have been here long enough to know where things settle, where the files of the inconvenient tend to gather, the ones marked with verdicts that are not quite condemnation and not quite approval, but something in between, something that sounds, when you read it aloud in an empty room, like an institution clearing its throat. I find her almost by accident. The way you find something in a room you have entered 100 times, suddenly, as though it moved toward you. Her file is thin. Thinner than the abbot's, thinner than the Polish hermit's, thin in the way of a life that was lived entirely inward, that left almost no institutional trace. Her name on the label has faded to near illegibility, a smear of ink that was once a woman. I hold the folder carefully, the way you hold something that might not survive being held, and I open it, and she is there in 2 documents only. The first is a single page, her handwriting cramped and fervent, the Latin careful in the way of someone who learned it from devotion rather than education. The second is the formal record of her dismissal as an unstable witness, written in a different hand entirely, administrative, efficient, the handwriting of an institution that has made up its mind. The single sentence is still legible. The stones will speak. That is all she wrote. Or perhaps it is all that was kept. I cannot know whether there was more, whether her voice was longer and only this fragment survived, or whether she understood, with the precision of genuine vision, that this was the only sentence she needed. The stones will speak. She is writing, I believe, from the late medieval period, from a small room in a cloister somewhere in Italy, from a life of prayer that the institution around her had already decided was too private to be significant, too interior to be useful. She is not a theologian. She has no standing. She writes the sentence, and then, presumably, she continues praying, because that is what her life is, and the sentence goes to Rome, and Rome looks at it, and Rome writes its verdict in the second document, and the second document is filed directly beside the first, and this is the thing I cannot stop sitting with, the thing that has been sitting with me since I first found her years ago, and finds me again now, every time I return to this shelf. The archive could not bear to separate the vision from the verdict. That is what I keep arriving at. Not that it preserved the prophecy despite the dismissal. Not that it kept the sentence as evidence against itself, but that it filed them together, as though the act of filing was itself a form of keeping faith with something it could not ratify. She is dismissed as an unstable witness, and directly beside that dismissal, touching it, is the thing she saw. The institution says, "This woman cannot be trusted," and then it keeps, in the same breath, what she said. I do not know what to call that. I have been trying to name it for years. It is not hypocrisy. It is not courage. It is something more like the behavior of a person who cannot quite bring themselves to throw away a letter from someone they have wronged, who keeps it in a drawer, who opens the drawer sometimes and does not read it, but knows it is there and is somehow made more honest by its presence. The Polish hermit is nearby, as he always is. His file is thicker than hers by several pages, though still thin by the archive's general standards, and his verdict is different from hers in a way that has taken me years to fully feel. His file is marked, "Too vague, not pursued." That is the phrase. Too vague, not pursued. The abbot from the day before was brilliant but untimely. The nun is an unstable witness. The hermit is too vague, not pursued. I hold his folder now, after hers, and I feel the difference in my hands. Not literally, not in the physical weight of the paper, but in the quality of silence each one generates when I open it. The abbot's verdict says, "We understand you, and we are not yet ready to say what you have said." There is a relationship in that verdict, a recognition. Untimely implies that the institution has placed the truth on a shelf it intends to return to, that it knows the address, that it has, in some sense, accepted delivery. The nun's verdict says, "We cannot hear you clearly enough to know what you mean, and so we cannot receive it." Unstable witness is a verdict about the channel, not the content. But too vague is something more unsettled than either of these. It is the verdict of an institution that cannot quite name its own discomfort, that feels something without being able to articulate what it feels, that closes the file not because it disagrees and not because it is waiting, but because it does not yet have the language to know what it is holding. Both the hermit and the nun end in the same closed drawer. Both their truths sit in the same still air, but they arrived there by different paths, and the difference in those paths is the difference between a truth the church understood and postponed, and a truth the church could not yet understand at all. He writes, "The hermit, somewhere in the 14th or 15th century, the dating in his file is uncertain, which is itself a kind of verdict, the archive's inability to place him precisely in time, suggesting that he stood slightly outside the time he was living in. He writes that the church will one day collapse from within, not from without, not from heretics or armies or the slow erosion of belief in the wider world, from within." He does not explain what he means by collapse, and perhaps that is why the verdict is what it is, too vague, not pursued. But sitting here now, in the amber light of a November afternoon, with the nun's file in one hand and his in the other, I think the vagueness was not a failure of his vision, but a faithfulness to it. He saw something he did not have, the institutional language to describe. He reached for words that were not yet available to him, reached toward a future that would not arrive for centuries, and the reaching left the sentence slightly open at the edges, slightly unresolved, and the institution received that openness as evidence of instability rather than as evidence of genuine difficulty of seeing across time. I put his file back. I put hers back. I stand for a moment in the stillness, which is always the same stillness, which does not vary with the season or the hour. And then I move, as I always move eventually, toward the heavier section. The one I approach with something that is not quite dread and not quite reverence, but partakes of both. Bruno's file is substantial. It does not feel thin in the hands. It has the weight of a complete institutional process. Every stage documented, every argument preserved, the full machinery of judgment made visible in paper and ink. and the particular careful Latin of men who understood that what they were doing would be read by others, that the record mattered. T. Had history was already watching over their shoulders, even as they wrote. The trial transcripts are complete. Every word survives. I have read them many times, and I read them again now, not because I expect to find something new, but because this is what the work requires. Proximity, repetition, the willingness to sit with what you already know as though knowing it is not enough, as though the document requires your presence, in order to remain fully real. Giordano Bruno, philosopher, cosmologist, a man who looks at the sky and sees what the sky is actually showing. Not the closed vault of a universe with the earth at its center, but something vast and open and plural. Multiple suns, multiple worlds, a cosmos that does not arrange itself around the convenience of human theology. He is not merely a scientist in the modern sense. He is something more dangerous than that to the world he is living in, because he is a man who thinks with genuine freedom, who follows an idea wherever it leads without first checking whether the destination is permitted. He arrives in Rome. He is tried. He is held. He is given years to recant, and he will not recant, because recanting would require him to say that what he sees is not what he sees, and this he cannot do, not because he is a martyr by temperament, but because he is a man of extraordinary intellectual honesty, and intellectual honesty, at its first extension, is indistinguishable from a kind of courage. The notation is not hidden. That is the thing I need you to understand. It is not buried in a separate file, not tucked into a sealed envelope, not preserved in a different section under a different designation. It is filed openly, directly among the trial transcripts as part of the record. One of the judges, whose name I will not give because the name is not the point, writes in what appears to be a private notation. The handwriting is slightly different from his formal entries, slightly less controlled. The pen pressed harder into the page as though the thought required more force. Unusual, he writes. If we burn him, history will not forgive us. They burn him anyway. In 1600, in the Campo de' Fiori, in February, in the early morning. They burn him with his mouth gagged because he has already said everything he intends to say. And they do not want to hear it again in public, do not want the crowd to hear it, do not want his final words to become the first words of something they cannot yet see coming. He dies. The world continues. The stars do not rearrange themselves in response to the verdict. The cosmos Bruno described does not pause to acknowledge what has been done in the name of a different description, and the judge's notation is filed. It is kept. It sits here now, in my hands, in the amber November light, and I am sitting with it, and I am not angry. I want to be clear about that. Anger would be too simple for what this room asks of me. Anger has a direction, a target, a clean line between the feeling and the thing that caused it. What I feel sitting here is something more diffuse and more permanent than anger. I am quietly devastated in the way you are devastated by a story you already knew would end badly. You knew it before you opened the file. You knew it before you descended the stairs this morning. You knew it the first time you read the history in a book somewhere above ground, in the ordinary world. And yet holding the pages changes something, because proximity is its own form of knowledge, and knowing something in your hands is different from knowing it in your mind. And the difference is the difference between understanding a grief and feeling it. The judge knew. That is what I keep returning to. The judge looked at Bruno and wrote, in private, in the handwriting of a man who is speaking to himself because there is no one else he can speak to honestly. He wrote that history would not forgive this. He was right. History has not forgiven it. And he did it anyway. And the archive kept his confession. It kept the doubt of the man who acted against his doubt, filed it openly beside the action it contradicts, preserved it not as evidence of conspiracy or as a hidden admission of guilt, but as evidence of something far more complicated and far more human. That institutions are made of people, that P People contain contradictions, and that the most radical thing a record can do is refuse to resolve those contradictions into something cleaner than they were. "The stones will speak," she wrote. The cloistered Italian nun whose name has faded on the label to something barely legible. The stones will speak, and they have. They are speaking now. Not in the dramatic register of revelation, not in the voice of scandal or exoneration, but in the quiet register of a file that is still here, still open, still waiting to be held. The archive has kept the record of its own speaking, and of every voice it could not hear clearly, and of every voice it postponed, and of the one voice it silenced permanently in a public square in February, and of the judge who knew the silencing was wrong and signed his name to it anyway, and then wrote down that he knew. I set down Bruno's file. I do not close it immediately. I let it rest open on my lap for a moment, in the amber light, the way you let a conversation rest before you end it, because ending it feels like a kind of abandonment. The air in this room does not move. The stillness is not emptiness. It is the accumulated presence of every truth this place has received and held and could not yet say, and of every truth it held and still cannot say, and of every truth it held, and finally, in the fullness of time, allowed to pass through into the light. I am not a scholar. I am something closer to a witness. And what I witness sitting here is not the failure of an institution, but the strange, imperfect, costly, ongoing attempt of an institution to be honest with itself, to keep even what it cannot say, to file even what it cannot ratify, to preserve even the doubt of the men who chose, in the end, to act against their doubt. The stones have spoken. The archive has kept the record of their speaking. I close the file. I return it to its place. The drawer closes with the sound that drawers make in this room, which is the sound of a century settling back into itself, patient, waiting, holding everything it has ever been given, letting nothing go. I carry that sound with me as I move deeper into the archive this morning. The drawers settling, that soft final compression of wood against wood, follows me down the corridor, the way a thought follows you from sleep, not quite audible, not quite gone. I am moving toward a different section now, a different register of human need. There is a corridor here that I think of as the most human in the building. Not the most dramatic, not the most historically consequential. Simply the most human, in the way that a waiting room is more human than a throne room, in the way that a letter unsent is sometimes more honest than one delivered. The folders here are thinner than the ones I handle in the theological and juridical sections. The handwriting is less practiced. The Latin, when there is Latin, is approximate. The grammar of a man who learned it from a village priest rather than a seminary, who uses it the way you use a language you have studied but never dreamed in. These are the letters from the periphery, from the cold parishes and the famine roads and the edges where the institution's certainty thins out and becomes something more like a question. I find the French peasant priest's letter in the third folder of the second drawer of a cabinet that has no particular distinction, no special marking, no archivist's note of significance. It is piled among other letters of the same approximate period, the same approximate desperation, as though the institution recognized even then that this particular quality of grief arrived regularly enough to require its own address. The folder does not say urgent. It does not say unresolved. It says, in the careful hand of whatever secretary received it, simply the priest's parish name and the year. That is all. As though the letter is ordinary. As though the question inside it is something the archive has been asked before and will be asked again. I lift it carefully. The paper is the kind that was made to be used rather than preserved, thin, slightly rough at the edges, the kind of paper a man buys because it is what he can afford, not because he imagines it will outlast him by 4 centuries. And yet here it is, here he is. I can feel, in the slight compression near the top right corner, the place where someone's thumb pressed it flat. You press a letter flat like that when you are reading it carefully, when you are deciding. The pressure is not aggressive. It is attentive. The pressure of someone leaning in, of someone giving the words their full weight. Someone read this, someone held it. And then. The evidence of that then is the folder itself, the careful filing, the preservation of what came after the reading, which is nothing, or rather, which is the thing the archive has spent years teaching me to recognize as the institution's most honest response to the unbearable. It keeps the question. It keeps the silence that follows the question. It keeps both with equal care, as though they are equally part of the record, which they are. The priest's hand trembles slightly in the script. I do not believe it is age. The letters are too controlled for age. The trembling is in the pressure, not the formation, as though the hand knows what it is doing, but the body beneath it is uncertain whether it has the right. He is writing to Rome. He is writing across a distance that is not merely geographical. He is a man standing at the edge of his own authority and reaching past it, the way you reach for something on a shelf that is almost too high, that you are not quite sure you should be touching. He is asking, in the approximate Latin of a village-trained priest, a question so unadorned that it has never left me since the first morning I held this page. The people are starving, he writes. They ask where God has gone. I do not know what to tell them. I am writing to Rome because I have no other address for what I am feeling. I sit with that for a moment. I do not rush past it. The archive has taught me not to rush past things, because rushing is a way of not seeing, and not seeing is the one failure this room cannot absorb. He has no other address for what he is feeling. He is a priest, which means the institution has given him, among other things, the responsibility of answering exactly this kind of question. And he cannot answer it. And so he writes to the institution itself, asking the institution to answer what the institution has tasked him to answer. Because somewhere in the chain of authority, there must be someone who knows, someone for whom the silence does not feel like an abyss, but like a vestibule, a place of tempera. Yai, waiting before the door opens into certainty. He is writing because he believes, or needs to believe, that the door exists. Rome receives the letter. Rome reads it. The thumb's pressure is proof of that. And Rome does what the archive records it doing. It files the letter, and it preserves the silence that follows. And the silence is so complete that it becomes, over the centuries, its own kind of document. 400 years of not answering is itself an answer, though not the kind the priest was looking for. Not the kind anyone was looking for. I think about what it costs, a bureaucracy to keep a question. It cannot answer. The instinct of institutions, of any institution, not only this one, is toward resolution. Toward the closed case, the answered letter, the file marked complete. There is a comfort in completion that is almost physical, the comfort of a drawer that closes flush, of a silence that has been earned rather than merely imposed. The archive keeps things that resist that comfort. It keeps the open questions alongside the closed ones, the unanswered alongside the answered, as though it understands, as though someone, somewhere in its long history, understood. That the unanswered question is not a failure of the archive. It is a record of the institution's encounter with the limits of its own knowledge, which is, if you think about it, the most honest thing a powerful institution can do. To say, this arrived. We did not know what to do with it. We kept it anyway. I return the priest's letter to its folder and move one drawer to the left, where the prayer of disillusionment waits in a folder of its own. I have been to this folder before. I will come back to it. It does not lose its weight with familiarity. If anything, the weight increases, the way the weight of a grief increases, not when it is new, but when it becomes permanent, when you stop waiting for it to lift and begin instead to arrange your life around it. The prayer is not filed among heresies. That is the thing I cannot stop thinking about. It is not filed among the mystical writings, not among the disciplinary cases, not among the records of failed vocations. It is filed in general correspondence. in a folder that contains, among other things, a request for a new church bell, a complaint about a neighboring bishop's land use, and a letter from a widow asking whether her husband, who died cursing God, can still be prayed for. The prayer of disillusionment is filed here, in this company, as though the secretary who received it made a quiet, considered decision. This is ordinary. This is not extraordinary grief. This is the kind of thing that arrives. The man who wrote it has no name. Or rather, his name was never recorded. Either he did not sign it, or the name was lost in some earlier handling, or someone, for reasons I cannot determine, removed it before filing. What remains is the prayer itself, and the prayer is this: I no longer know who I speak to when I kneel. I have knelt for 40 years. I have spoken the words. I do not know if there is anything on the other side of the words. I am not asking you to tell me there is. I am only asking you to know that I have kept kneeling, and that the keeping is harder than I can explain, and that I am writing this down because I have to write it somewhere, and I do not know where else to send it. He sends it to Rome. Rome files it in general correspondence. And this filing decision, this quiet bureaucratic act of categorization, is the chapter's revelation, or at least the revelation the archive has been pressing into my hands this morning. The institution, in its precision, in its centuries of accumulated administrative intelligence, looks at this prayer and does not mark it exceptional, does not quarantine it, does not forward it to the offices that handle dangerous ideas. It places it among the ordinary correspondence of ordinary days because the institution knows, because whoever received it knew, that this prayer was not singular, that it had arrived before, that it would arrive again, that there is a folder for it. There is a folder for the loss of faith. The archive keeps it. Mateo understood this eventually, though it took him years. His early letters home to his mother are full of the breathlessness of arrival, the guilt and the marble, the processions, the sense of moving inside a history so large it rearranges your sense of your own size. He writes about the Apostolic Palace, the way a young man writes about a cathedral the first time he understands that a cathedral is not merely a building, but an argument in stone, an assertion about the nature of the universe, about where the human stands in relation to the divine. He is dazzled. He is grateful. His faith in those early letters is not complicated. It is the faith of a man who has been given everything he asked for and finds it to be exactly as beautiful as he imagined. The later letters are quieter. Not disillusioned, not quite, not yet, but quieter in the way a room is quiet when the guests have gone and you are alone with the furniture, which is still beautiful but no longer animated by the presence of others. He writes about the archive with increasing frequency, and what he describes is not the grandeur but the smallness of his own position within it. He is a custodian, as I am. He handles folders. He maintains the silence. He is very good at his work, he says, but he has begun to notice that the work does not leave room for the questions it keeps raising. Every folder he opens contains something the institution could not answer. Every drawer he closes contains a silence the institution has preserved. And he, Mateo, has nowhere to put what that does to him. The Apostolic Palace, he writes to his mother, is architecturally certain. Its arches know exactly where they are going. Its corridors do not waver. It is a place that has organized itself around the idea that the questions have been answered, that the map is complete, that the territory has been fully named. And his small bewilderments, the ones that arrive in the night, the ones that press against the inside of his chest when he holds a letter like the peasant priests and cannot look away from the unanswered silence after it. His small bewilderments have no room to stand upright in such a place. They have to file themselves. That is what he learns. He learns to do what the archive does, to keep the question carefully, to preserve the silence around it, to maintain both without resolution. It is not a comfortable way to live inside an institution, but it is, he comes to understand, the only honest way. Because the alternative, the pretense that the questions do not arrive, that the bewilderments are not real, that the archive is simply a warehouse for answers rather than a custodianship of everything the institution has ever encountered, answered, or not. The alternative is a kind of forgetting. And forgetting, in this room, is the one thing the walls will not allow. His letters to his mother stop mentioning the guilt. They start mentioning the light, which is different. The light that comes through the small windows in the lower corridors in the late afternoon, the way it crosses the dust in the air, the way it makes the dust visible, which is the only way you ever know the dust is there. He is learning to see what is suspended. He is learning, as I have learned, that the archive's great gift is not the documents themselves, but the quality of attention they require. You cannot rush here. You cannot skim. Every page asks you to be present to it, to give it the time it took to write, to hold the paper the way the hand that wrote it held the pen, carefully, with full awareness that what is being set down may outlast everyone in the room. I return the priest's letter to its folder now. I close the drawer with the care I always use, the slow and deliberate care that is itself a form of respect. Not reverence exactly, nothing so formal as that, but the ordinary human decency of handling something fragile as though it matters, because it does. The drawer closes. The sound is the sound this room makes when it absorbs something back into itself. Quiet, complete, unhurried. I remain still for a moment in what surrounds the folder. Not the document. I have returned the document to its place. What I am sitting with now is the preserved silence after it. The white space in the record that the archive has maintained as faithfully as any text. The absence of a reply, held as carefully as the letter itself, filed alongside it, kept whole across 4 centuries, so that whoever comes here, so that I, this morning, can know not only that the question was asked, but that the silence was real. That it was not an accident or an oversight, but a choice, or the thing that comes before a choice, the breath held before a word that does not come. Keeping an unanswered prayer is not mercy. I know that. I have thought about it enough mornings in this room to have moved past the comfortable interpretation, the one that makes the institution's silence into a kind of tenderness. It is not mercy. The priest needed an answer. The man who wrote the prayer of disillusionment needed someone to say, "Yes, I hear you. You are not alone in this." They did not receive that. They received, instead, the careful filing of their need, the preservation of their question, the institutional guarantee that what they sent into the vastness would not be lost. That is not the same as being heard. It is not the same as being answered. But it is not cruelty either. It is something the archive has taken years to teach me to name, and I am still not certain I have the right name for it. It is the institution's quiet, unspectacular admission that the question was real, that it arrived, that it was held, that holding it carefully, completely, across the long centuries is the only answer the archive knows how to give. Not because the archive is withholding something better, but because this is what it has: the custody of the question, the preservation of the asking, the guarantee that when the drawer opens again, in another decade or another century, the letter will still be there, the silence, after it's still intact, the thumb's impression still faintly visible on the upper corner of the page where someone pressed it flat and decided with full awareness of what. They were deciding to keep it and say nothing. The archive breathes around me. The air does not move. The silence is not empty. It is full of what has been placed inside it. Question after question, prayer after prayer, all the things the institution encountered and could not answer and could not destroy, kept here in the dark with the same care. You keep a name you are not ready to speak aloud. I sit with it. I let it sit with me. Outside, the city is waking into its ordinary noise. Down here, the century continues its patient, unhurried settling, and the drawer holds everything it has ever been given and lets nothing go. There is a section of the archive I approach differently from the others, not with more caution. The word is wrong. Caution implies a threat, and there is no threat here, only a quality of air that is somehow denser than the air in the adjacent rooms, as though the centuries have compressed themselves more tightly in this particular corridor, as though history has more specific gravity in a place where decisions were made that could not be unmade. I have been here hundreds of times. The pause at the threshold is not new. What remains perpetually new is what the place asks of me, not more reverence than I bring elsewhere, but a different kind, the kind you carry into a room where something was decided, and the deciding is still present in the walls, still faintly audible, if you know how to listen for the frequency of old consequence. This is where the index lives, not the books themselves. The books are gone. They were consumed by fires, the church ordered, and history completed, and what survives is not the text, but the administrative residue of the text's destruction. The lists, the formal condemnations written in the careful Latin of institutional certainty, the correspondence between local readers and Roman authorities that moved slowly across the continent by courier and horse, by ship and sandaled foot, arriving here weeks or months after the question was first asked, the answer traveling back with the same unhurried weight. What survives, most significantly, are the marginal annotations, the private notations left by the men who read these works with genuine, sometimes anguished care before determining that others could not be permitted to read them. I pull on my gloves, I open the first folio, and I begin, as I always begin, with the awareness that I am holding not just a record, but a mind, a specific, trained, often brilliant mind that sat in a room not entirely unlike this one and read something that moved it, troubled it, illuminated it, and then set it aside and signed the condemnatae. On. This is not hypocrisy. I want to be precise about that. The word hypocrisy belongs to a different kind of story, a simpler one, and what the archive holds is never simple. What I find here, in these margins, is something more painful and more interesting than hypocrisy. It is the record of men who understood exactly what they were condemning, who followed the argument to its conclusion, saw the conclusion clearly, and then, for reasons the archive preserves but does not explain, signed the document that foreclosed it. There is a cardinal's notation on the Galileo record. I have held it before. I hold it now, and the act of holding it does not diminish it. If anything, each encounter adds a layer of weight, the way a stone gains warmth from repeated handling. The notation is brief. It is written in a hand that is careful and controlled, the hand of a man accustomed to writing with authority, and it says this: he is not wrong about the motion, only about the authority. 7 words in Latin that contain the entire tragedy of the Galileo affair more precisely than any biography, any trial transcript, any subsequent century of commentary. He is not wrong about the motion. The cardinal knows. He has read Galileo's work with the full attention of a trained intellect, and arrived where Galileo arrived, because the argument is sound, and the evidence is real, and a mind of sufficient quality cannot look at sufficient evidence and conclude otherwise. Only about the authority. And there it is. The institution is not defending cosmology. It is defending something more fragile and more foundational than cosmology. It is defending the premise that the Church speaks with a single voice, that the voice does not contradict itself, that the edifice of certainty, which holds an entire civilization in its moral architecture, cannot develop verse. Isible cracks without risk of collapse. The cardinal knows this. He knows both things simultaneously, that Galileo is right about the motion, and that saying so officially in the language of Rome in the year 1633 is a structural risk the institution cannot absorb. He writes his knowledge in the margin. He signs the condemnation, and the archive keeps both, the knowledge and the act, with the same impartial, patient preservation it extends to everything it receives. I do not editorialize this. I have learned not to. The notation speaks. My task is to listen. I move deeper into the section. The folios multiply. The index, at its height, contains thousands of titles, not only the great scientific works that history remembers, but the quieter, stranger condemnations, the mystics and the reformers, and the poets whose offenses were more subtle, whose books arrived at inconvenient angles, pointing toward truth. The institution was not yet prepared to name. There is a Flemish theologian whose work on the nature of mercy is condemned, not because his theology is wrong, the marginalia are clear on this, but because his conclusion that mercy precedes law rather than follows it would reorganize the relationship between the faithful and the institution, in ways the institution cannot permit. The reader who annotates his file writes a beautiful argument and dangerous precisely because it is beautiful. The beauty is the danger. The clarity is the threat. The archive keeps the assessment. The archive keeps the condemnation. It does not choose between them. There is a Spanish mystic, a woman whose visions are dismissed as disordered imagination. The formal condemnation is brief, almost dismissive, written in the shorthand of institutional efficiency. But beneath the official text, in a different hand, someone has written a single sentence that is not administrative notation, but something else entirely, something that belongs more to prayer than to policy. What she saw, I do not know how to refute. The annotation is unsigned. The mystery of its authorship has occupied me for years. A junior reader? A senior cardinal who could not bring himself to sign it openly. It does not matter, finally. What matters is that it is here, that it survived, that whoever wrote it trusted the archive with what they could not say aloud, the way you slip a note under a door in the dark and walk away, trusting the morning to deliver it to the right hands. And then there is Gregory's letter. Pope Gregory XIV begins it in the firm, confident hand of a man who has occupied the chair of Peter for 3 years and has learned to write in the register of certainty, because the papacy is, above all, a performance of certainty, a daily reenactment of the premise that the Church knows and knowing does not waver. The opening lines are exactly that, firm, declarative, the hand moving across the page with the practiced authority of a man who has never lacked for words, who has spent a lifetime in the company of words and knows how to arrange them into fortifications. And then, somewhere in the 3rd paragraph, something shifts. I have looked at this letter many times, and I can tell you the exact sentence where the shift occurs, the exact clause where the hand begins, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. It is where Gregory turns from the question of the condemned works to the question of the men who wrote them, not their errors, but their intentions, their evident love of God, their evident desire to understand rather than to undermine. The sentences grow longer. They begin to fold back on themselves, qualifying, reconsidering, opening subordinate clauses that lead not to conclusions but to further questions. The handwriting does not deteriorate. Gregory is too disciplined for deterioration. But it changes in quality, becomes more searching, less declarative, the pen moving more slowly as though the thought is requiring more effort to sustain, as though the argument is pulling against the direction. The letter is supposed to go, and then the ink trails, mid-sentence. Not at a natural pause, not at the end of a thought, but in the middle of a clause that was building towards something. I can feel it building, even now, even in the silence of this room. I can feel the shape of what he was about to say, the way you feel the shape of a word you cannot quite retrieve. Present, but not yet available, hovering at the edge of utterance. The sentence stops. The ink trails to the right in a thin, diminishing line that is not a period, not a comma, not any mark of intentional punctuation, but simply the place where the hand stopped moving, because the mind had arrived somewhere. It could not follow itself in writing. The letter was never sent. It is preserved in its incompleteness, filed with its envelope, the seal unbroken because the letter never reached the stage of sealing, never reached the stage of sending, never reached the moment of release. The archive received it as Gregory left it, unfinished, unsent, the trailing ink still carrying, 4 centuries later, the ghost of the hesitation that stopped it. I do not try to complete what Gregory could not finish. That would be a kind of violence, the imposition of resolution on something that is honest precisely because it is unresolved. The incompleteness is the document. The archive understands this. It has preserved the trailing ink with the same care. It preserves the finished sentences, the signed condemnations, the formal declarations of certainty. It does not privilege completion. It preserves the full range of what the institution was capable of producing, including the moments when the institution, in the person of one of its supreme authorities, arrived at the edge of what it could hold and stopped there, the pen still in the hand, the thought still forming, the century S still waiting. I think of Mateo. I have been thinking of Mateo since I entered this section, though I did not know it until now, until Gregory's trailing ink made the connection visible. Mateo, the page boy from the previous century, who sat in the ante-room of power and wondered at things no one had arranged a language to receive. Mateo's wonder turned to loneliness because the institution had no container for it, no form into which it could be poured without spilling. And Gregory, the supreme pontiff, the vicar of Christ, the man with every language of the institution at his disposal. Gregory arrives at exactly the same place, the edge, the limit of what the structure can hold, the point where the thought exceeds the available form and the pen stops and the letter is never sent. They are the same figure at different scales. The page boy who had nowhere for his doubts, and the Pope who could not finish his most honest sentence. Both of them standing at the boundary of what the institution can accommodate, leaving the excess in the only place they trust, the margins, the unfinished page, the archive's patient dark. The individual swallowed not by malice, but by the institution's inability to hold its own complexity aloud. The Church is vast enough to contain their doubts, but not yet ready to speak them. And so the doubts accumulate here, in these folios, in these careful boxes, in the trailing ink of a letter that was never sent and was never destroyed and has been waiting with the patience of everything in this blah. C, for a witness who can sit with it without demanding that it resolve. I close the folio. I close the box. I do not close the question because the archive does not close questions. It holds them open in the dark. What I carry out of this section is not scandal. I have been here too long for scandal. Scandal requires surprise, and nothing here surprises me any more in the way that produces outrage or indignation. What I carry out is something that takes longer to name and sits less comfortably in the chest. A kind of sorrowful tenderness, the specific emotion of recognizing intelligence in the service of an impossible task, of watching minds of real quality bend themselves against the grain of their own conclusions in service of something larger than their conclusions, and leaving the evidence of the bending in the margins, quietly trusting the archive to keep it. The cardinal knew about the motion. He wrote it down. He signed the condemnation. These are not 3 separate acts. They are one continuous act of a man who understood that knowledge and authority are not the same thing, that being right is not sufficient permission to say so, and that the institution he served was in some way more important to him than his own rightness, or that he believed it was, in that room, in that year, with the evidence arranged before him and the pen in his hand. I do not know if he was correct in that belief. The archive does not know either. The archive simply holds the belief and the doubt together, in the same folder with the same impartial care. I walk back through the corridor toward the main reading room. The air resettles behind me, that cultivated stillness closing in the wake of my passage, the way water closes behind a hand withdrawn from it. The folios remain, the trailing ink remains. Gregory's unfinished sentence remains at the edge of its own incompletion, waiting with the infinite patience of a thought that has nowhere left to go and has accepted that as its permanent condition. Outside, somewhere above me, The city conducts its business in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon. Down here, the light does not change. Down here, the index is not a monument to censorship, but something more complicated and more human than censorship. A record of the distance between what individuals within the church could see and what the church as an institution could say. That distance is not hypocrisy. It is the structural tragedy of every organization large enough to outlive the understanding of any individual within it. The church contains minds that can follow an argument wherever it leads. It contains a structure that cannot always follow the minds. The archive sits between them, receiving what neither can fully hold, keeping everything, destroying nothing, waiting with the particular patience of a place that has learned to measure time, not in years, but in the slow accumulation of what has not yet been said. I set the cardinal's marginal note down on the table. I look at it for a moment longer than is strictly necessary. He is not wrong about the motion, only about the authority. The most compressed tragedy in this room. The most honest thing a man in that position could write, written in a place where only the archive would read it. Trust it to the dark the way you trust a secret to someone you know will outlive you, someone who will still be here when the question finally becomes speakable, when the institution fin. Alley arranges itself to receive what its own members have known for centuries and left carefully in the margins of the record. I put on my coat. I prepare to ascend. And behind me, the section closes into its own silence, the folios settling, the trailing ink continuing its patient, permanent mid-sentence stop, the unfinished letter breathing quietly in its envelope, the archive holding everything it has ever been given and letting nothing go. But I do not ascend. I am 3 steps toward the stairs when something stops me. Not a sound. There is no sound here. Not truly, only the occasional whisper of climate control, the faint settling of stone that has been settling for 500 years. It is something else. A pull. The archive does this sometimes, exerts a kind of gravity that has nothing to do with physics and everything to do with the particular weight of unfinished business. I stand on the 3rd step for a long moment. Then I come back down. I remove my coat. I set it over the back of the wooden chair that has occupied this corner since before anyone now living was born. I sit. What has drawn me back is the canonization registry, not the completed causes, not the golden declarations, the papal bulls, the formal documents that have made certain names into feast days, into calendar saints, into the permanent company of heaven, as the Church has officially recognized it. Those records are complete and properly indexed and as settled as anything in this place can be said to be settled. What draws me back tonight? And I see now that it is evening, that the light from the high, narrow window has gone the color of old vellum, is the other registry, the suspended causes, the open files. The section that sits at the end of the cabinet like a sentence that has never been allowed to finish. Canonization is the Church's most deliberate act. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters here more than anywhere. When the Church declares a person a saint, it is not offering an opinion. It is not suggesting or recommending or celebrating. It is speaking in the full weight of its authority. An institution that has organized the moral imagination of Western civilization for 2,000 years, that has survived the fall of Rome and the Black Death and the Reformation and 2 world wars. And it is saying, with everything it has, this: person is with God. This life was holy. This example is worth following. Forever. It is perhaps the most irreversible thing the Church does. Popes can be revised, councils can be reconvened, doctrines can be developed, expanded, refined at the edges. But a saint, once declared, is declared. The calendar does not unname. This is why the suspended causes matter so much, because what sits in these open files is not the record of lives that fell short. It is not the record of causes investigated and found wanting, of holiness examined and found insufficient. What sits here, and I hold the first folder now, feeling its particular density, the way a thick file has a different gravity than a thin one. is the record of lives that met the standard completely and were set aside anyway. The distinction is everything. The wartime bishop's file is the thickest in this section. I have handled it many times, and its weight still surprises me, the way a familiar grief can still surprise. It is not one folder, but 4, bound together with a cloth ribbon that was once red and is now the color of dried roses. Inside are letters, survivor testimony, accounts written by the priests who served alongside him, who watched him move through the wreckage of occupied Europe with a kind of furious, disciplined love that had no interest in its own safety. There are names in these pages, families, children, the particular addresses of particular hiding places. And reading them is like watching holiness in its most unadorned form, which is to say, a person doing the right thing when the right thing is terrifying, doing it again, not be. Because he does not feel the fear, but because he has decided that the fear is not the most important thing he feels. His name I do not write here. The archive has its own protocols of privacy, and I have learned to honor them not as bureaucratic constraint, but as something closer to tenderness. He is real. He is documented. He is, by any measure the Church has ever applied to the question of holiness, a saint. His cause is suspended. I read through the investigator's notes slowly, as I always do, because the investigator's notes are where the truth of a suspended cause lives. The holiness is never in question. The investigator does not question it. The survivor testimony is overwhelming, consistent, specific in the way that genuine memory is specific. Not the clean arc of a story told many times until it becomes legend, but the jagged, particular, sometimes contradictory texture of things actually witnessed. One woman remembers that he smelled of tobacco. A priest remembers that he lost his temper once, badly, over something small, and then spent an hour in visible anguish over having done so. A child, grown now, remembers only his hands, large hands, she writes, that felt like safety. None of this is what suspends the cause. What suspends the cause is quieter than all of that, and I have come to think it is the most honest thing in the file. There is a single page, written in a careful administrative hand, that notes the institutional complexity of proceeding. The bishop's holiness, the note observes, is not separable from his context. His canonization would require the Church to speak about what it knew, and when, and what it did with that knowledge in the years when he was doing what he was doing. It would require the Church to stand beside him in the historical record, and standing beside him means standing in that moment, and that moment is one the institution has not yet fully learned to inhabit. The note does not say any of this directly. It speaks in the careful language of procedural delay, of further discernment required, of the cause remaining open for future consideration. But I have been reading this language long enough to hear what is underneath it. The Church is not saying he was not holy. The Church is saying that his holiness points somewhere it is not yet ready to go. I set the file down and sit with this for a while. There is a notation from the Bruno trial that returns to me now, one of the judges, writing in his private record, the sentence that has never left me since I first encountered it. If we burn him, history will not forgive us. They burn him anyway, but between that moment in 1600 and the moment this bishop's cause is suspended, something has shifted in the institution's relationship to its own worst impulses. The Church has learned in the intervening centuries to stop short of the most visible forms of injustice. It does not burn the bishop. It does not condemn him. It keeps his file. It leaves his cause open. This is progress of a kind, and I do not want to be ungenerous about it, because ungenerousness is easy and the truth is more complicated than easy. But stopping short is not the same as acting rightly. Postponement carries its own form of cost. The bishop is not burned, he is simply not named, and the families he saved and the priests who watched him and the child who remembers his hands, they wait. The ecumenical mystic's file is thinner. She is a woman from the early 20th century. a contemplative who spent 40 years in correspondence with Protestant and Orthodox theologians, finding in their traditions not deviation from truth, but refraction of it. The same light, she writes, passing through different glass. Her theology is careful, her mysticism authenticated by the traditional markers, her personal holiness attested to by everyone who knew her. Her cause is suspended on grounds that her writings, taken in their fullness, might be read as suggesting that the Catholic Church is one path among several rather than the singular path. She does not say this. But she does not say the opposite either. She says something more difficult, which is that she has found God in places she was not told to look, and she cannot pretend otherwise. Her file includes a letter she writes to her confessor near the end of her life, in which she says something that I find myself returning to more than almost anything else I have encountered in this archive. She writes, "I am not afraid of being wrong. I am only afraid that the truth I have found will be lost because the place I found it was inconvenient." Her confessor's response is not in the file. Perhaps he did not respond. Perhaps his response went elsewhere. The archive keeps her letter and the silence after it, which is, I have come to understand, the archive's particular form of witness. The Latin American activist's file is thinner still. He is a priest who spends his life in the company of the poor, not as a metaphor, not as a pastoral program, but as a literal daily fact. Eating what they eat, living where they live, dying of the same diseases that take them, because he will not leave for better conditions when they cannot. His cause is suspended during the years when liberation theology is under formal scrutiny, when the institution is trying to draw a line between the gospel's preferential option for the poor and what it fears is Marxist infiltration of the faith. He is not a Marxist. His file makes this clear. He is a man who has read the Sermon on the Mount so many times that it has become the operating principle of his entire life, and the institution cannot quite find a way to canonize the Sermon on the Mount without also, in this moment, seeming to endorse something it is trying to resist. His cause remains open. The line he walks between the gospel and the politics of his moment is a line the Church cannot yet ratify. And then there is the nurse. Her cause has been opened and closed 3 times across 2 centuries. 3 times. I find this almost unbearable. The first opening is in the late 18th century, when a local bishop initiates the process in response to popular devotion so intense and so widespread that it cannot be ignored. The first closing comes within a decade, for reasons the file does not fully specify. Something about the timing, something about other priorities, the word untimely appearing in the margin like a recurring diagnosis. The second opening is in the mid-19th century, during a cholera epidemic, when her memory surges back into the collective consciousness of the region she served. She had walked into epidemic zones without protection, without hesitation, without the particular kind of moral calculation that weighs one's own survival against another person's need. The second closing comes again, quietly, the file settling back into the drawer. The third opening is in the 20th century, and I am looking at it now, and the cause is still open, and the file ends here, in the middle of a sentence that an investigator began and did not finish, and I do not know whether the investigator simply stopped, or moved to other work, or died, or WW. Ether. The sentence is still being written somewhere outside this room. What the nurse's file crystallizes, sitting here in the evening light, is what this entire section of the archive is ultimately about. Not corruption, not conspiracy, something more painful than either of those, because both of those can be named and resisted and eventually overcome. What this is about is the cost of an institution that must speak with one voice, in one moment, and cannot always arrange itself in time. The Church does not doubt these people's holiness. It doubts its own readiness. And readiness, as it turns out, is not a fixed point, but a moving one, always slightly ahead of where the institution stands, always requiring one more step, one more decade, one more arrangement of internal circumstance before the moment is right. Postponement is not neutrality. I want to say this clearly, because the archive's preservation of these files can be mistaken for a kind of bureaucratic patience, as though keeping the cause open is the same as keeping the door open. It is not. An open file is not an open door. It is a door that has not yet been opened, which is a different thing, and the difference is felt most acutely by the people on the other side of it. The families, the communities, the traditions of devotion that have formed around these lives and wait, generation after generation, for a ratificati on that does not come. And yet, the archive keeps them. This is not nothing. I have spent enough time in this room to know that the alternative, the destruction of inconvenient causes, the deliberate erasure of holy lives that pointed in uncomfortable directions, has happened elsewhere, in other institutions, in other centuries. The archive does not do this. It keeps the wartime bishop's forefolders bound in faded ribbon. It keeps the mystic's letter and the silence after it. It keeps the activist's file suspended at the precise moment of institutional anxiety that could not accommodate his witness. It keeps the nurse's unfinished sentence. There is a form of grief that does not announce itself. It does not wail. It does not demand. It sits in a room with the evidence of what it cannot yet say, and it keeps the evidence, and it waits. I do not know if this is the church's grief, or the archive's grief, or my own, and I have stopped trying to separate them. They are all the same grief, in the end. The grief of knowing that holiness arrived, that it was real, that it was documented, that it was witnessed, and that the institution moved at the speed of institutions, which is to say, slowly, carefully, always one step behind the lives it is trying to on. Or, the suspended causes sit in their permanent present tense, neither canonized nor dismissed, neither completed nor abandoned, held in a silence that is its own form of witness, in a room where the air does not move, by an archive that has never learned to throw anything away. I do not resolve this. I remain with it. Outside, somewhere above the weight of all this stone, the city continues its ordinary life. The traffic, the tourists, the evening bells of 100 churches naming the hour. Down here, the hour is not named. Down here, the wartime bishop's hands are still large, still feel like safety, still move through the occupied dark toward the families who need him. Down here, the mystic is still writing her letter, still finding God in places she was not told to look. Down here, the nurse is still walking into the epidemic zone, still not calculating, still not stopping. The archive keeps them here, in this permanent and unresolved present, and I think, sitting in the wooden chair with my coat still folded over the back of it, the evening light gone now to something darker, I think that this keeping is the closest the institution comes, in its most honest moments, to the holiness it cannot yet name. It keeps them. It does not let them go. Tomorrow the drawer will close. Tonight it remains open. The journal is not on the shelf where such things are kept. It is on my table. I notice this the moment I descend on a morning in late winter, the kind of morning when the air above ground carries the particular quality of a city not yet awake, and the air down here carries no quality at all except its own ancient stillness. Someone has placed it there. Another archivist, I will later learn, who handled it only briefly and with gloves and said nothing to me about it, because there is nothing to say about a thing like this that does not reduce it. It sits in its case, the case no longer sealed, the ribbon that held it lying loose beside it like something that has finished its work. I stand in my coat for a moment. I do not reach for it immediately. I understand, in the way you understand certain things before you have any evidence for the understanding, that what is in this case will not leave me the way other things have left me. I take off my coat. I hang it on the back of the chair. I sit down. The journal is ordinary in my hands. This is the first thing, and I want to say it plainly, because I have spent years in this place learning to resist the pull of the dramatic object, the impulse to make the physical thing carry the weight of what it contains. It does not. It is a journal, It has the weight of a journal. Its cover is worn in the way that covered things wear when they are handled, often by careful hands. The pages have the density of pages that have absorbed the particular humidity of a sealed room over many decades. When I open it, the smell is paper and time and nothing else. There is no thunder. There is no revelation in the physical act of opening. There is only the first entry, in a hand I recognize from other documents, precise, unhurried, the handwriting of a man who has spent a lifetime writing for the record. And then the stillness in me deepens into something I do not have a word for, something below stillness, the way a well goes below. The earth it is dug through. I am reading agony. I do not say this to heighten the moment. I say it because it is the only accurate word for what the first entries contain. He knows. This is what I understand within the first pages, and the understanding arrives not as revelation, but as confirmation of something the archive has been preparing me to receive for years. Pius XVII knows, in the early entries of this journal, what is happening to the Jewish people of Europe. He knows not in the way a man knows a rumor, or suspects a report, or receives an intelligence summary and files it for later consideration. He knows in the way that only a man who has read every source, cross-referenced every account, and sat alone with the accumulated weight of that knowledge can know. He names places, he names numbers. He names what is being done and how and by whose order and with what efficiency. He does not flinch from the precision of it. He writes it down, all of it, in this journal that no one else will read, because he is a man who cannot carry a truth without naming it, even when naming it changes nothing, even when naming it is the only act available to him. And then he writes the calculation. I turn the pages slowly. I am aware of my own reluctance. The way you move slowly through certain rooms, not because you are afraid of what you will find, but because you already know what you will find, and you want to give it the proper time, the proper attention, the weight it deserves. The calculation is not simple. I want to say this carefully, because the world outside this vault has spent decades reaching for the simple version. The verdict that requires a villain, or the verdict that requires a saint, because either is easier than what is actually here. What is actually here is a man doing mathematics with human lives, and knowing that every number in his equation is also a person, and doing it anyway because the alternative is to do nothing, and doing nothing is also a choice, and that choice also has a number. He writes that speech may accelerate the killing. He writes this not as excuse, but as analysis, and the analysis is careful and sourced and terrible. He has received reports from within the occupied territories, from bishops and nuncios and ordinary priests who have watched what happens when a local authority is pressured from above. Watch the pressure become pretext, watch the pretext become acceleration. He writes that he believes a public condemnation from Rome, in his voice carrying his authority, will be used, will be taken up and weaponized and pointed at the very people he would be speaking to protect. He writes, I do not know if I am right. I write this so that someone will know I asked the question. I stop. I set the page down without releasing it. The lamp above my table is the only light in the vault at this hour, and in its circle I sit with that sentence, and I understand why the Church sealed this journal, and it is not what the world has assumed. The world has assumed concealment. The world has assumed the seal was placed to protect a reputation, his or the institutions or the fragile architecture of a post-war moral order that needed its pope to have been either brave or at least explicably silent. But that is not what I am holding. What I am holding is the opposite of concealment. The seal was placed to protect complexity itself, to protect a document so irreducibly human, so resistant to the clean verdict that releasing it before the world had any framework for receiving it would have been its own form of violence. Against the truth it contained, against the man it recorded, against the very possibility of moral understanding that requires time and distance and the willingness to sit with what cannot be resolved. He writes about silence as atrocity. He does not excuse himself from this. In the middle entries, where the handwriting becomes slightly less precise, not trembling, but compressed, as though he is writing faster than he wishes to, as though the thoughts are arriving ahead of his ability to order them, he writes that he knows silence is not neutral. He knows that the world will not understand silence as calculation. He knows that history will read silence as complicity, and he writes, in a sentence, "I will carry out of this vault with me and never fully set down. I accept this. I accept that history will not forgive me. I ask only that someone keep this record so that history will know I did not forgive myself either." I turn the page. I keep reading. What I find in the later entries is not resolution. There is no entry in which he arrives at peace. There is no entry in which the calculation resolves into certainty, in which the impossible choice reveals itself to have been the right one after all. What there is, instead, is continuation. Day after day, entry after entry, he continues to receive the reports and to write them down and to sit with the weight of what he has chosen and to choose it again, each day, because each day it remains the choice he believes will cost the fewest lives, and each day he is less certain, and each day. The uncertainty is recorded here, in this journal, in this vault, in this case that sat sealed for decades and now sits open on my table in the light of a single lamp. This is a man. This is what I know when I finally reach the last entry, which is not dramatic, which does not announce itself as a last entry, which is simply the last page that was written, and after which the journal continues in blank pages that were never filled. A man facing the impossible, doing what men do when they face the impossible, which is not to transcend it and not to be destroyed by it, but to live inside it, one day at a time, writing the doubt down because writing is the only act that makes the doubt survivable. When the archive opens this journal to scholars, years after I first hold it, I understand that opening as a moral act of the same order as the sealing. Not exoneration, not condemnation, not the management of a reputation or the rehabilitation of a figure the Church has invested in defending. It is something simpler and more difficult than any of those things. It is the archive's deepest and most consistent commitment, the one that has run beneath every document I have handled in these vaulted rooms, beneath the Jesuits' untimely letter and the judge's confessed doubt and the French priest's unanswered question and the prayer of the man whose name is lost. The commitment to preservation without editing, to keeping the record whole rather than simplified, to trusting that complexity, given enough time, can be received. The world outside is still arguing. I know this without ascending to confirm it. The world outside is still reaching for the clean verdict, the simple story, the man who was either coward or saint, because the world outside requires its moral judgments to arrive in forms that can be spoken quickly, transmitted easily, held up in one hand. I do not fault the world for this. Moral clarity is not a small thing. Moral clarity is how atrocity is named, and how it is resisted, and how the people it destroys are mourned. But moral clarity and moral truth are not always the same thing, and what this archive holds, what it has always held, in every drawer and folder and sealed case, in every one of these vaulted rooms, is the space between them. The space where the institution knows what it cannot yet say. The space where the untimely truth waits for its moment. The space where a man writes his doubt into a journal and trusts someone to keep it. I close the journal with both hands, slowly. The way you close something you know will not leave you. The ribbon lies on the table beside the case, and I do not retie it. That is not my place, and the case is sealed no longer, and the ribbon has finished what it was given to do. I sit for a moment in the silence of the vault, which is the same silence it has always been, the cultivated silence of centuries, the silence of a place that has learned to hold what cannot yet be spoken, and to hold it without judgment, without urgency, without the need for a verdict. Outside, the world is still arguing about Pius XIII. It will argue for a long time yet. The argument is necessary. The argument is part of how we keep faith with the dead, how we insist that what happened to them matters, how we refuse the comfort of forgetting. But inside the vault, the journal sits in its case, which is sealed no longer, and says something more difficult and more true than the argument can reach. It says, he was a man. He faced the impossible. He did what men do when they face the impossible. He chose, and he doubted the choice, and he wrote the doubt down, and he trusted someone to keep it. The archive kept it. That is not absolution. That is not condemnation. It is something older and quieter than either. The act of a custodian, of an institution that has learned over centuries of keeping what it cannot say, that the most honest thing in the world is not the verdict but the record, not the answer but the question, preserved whole, set down carefully, held in the dark of a room where the air does not move, where the lamp above the table is the only light, where the silence has been cultivated with intention and patience and a certain willingness to let things wait. I put on my coat. I do not look back at the table as I ascend. I do not need to. The journal is there. It will be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and in all the days that come after I am gone from this place, and another custodian descends these stairs and finds it waiting. Not on a shelf where such things are kept, but on a table, in the light of a single lamp ready to be held again by hand. S. That did not expect to be changed by it. This is the archive's last word. It is offered in silence.